All right, now we do deep water horizon. Yeah, I haven't found any other shots where the oil looks like this. I think this is a little bit of an artifact of like getting the camera at the right angle, but this was in 2010, so recent enough that a number of us probably heard about it in one way or another. So here we are, right? So here's Louisiana, right, in the Gulf Coast. So we are kind of southeast of where the Mississippi River comes out. It's kind of small, kind of hard to see here, right? But this is where the actual drilling rig is. So this is offshore oil drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. Here is where the Mississippi River comes out, the so-called Bird's Foot Delta, and you'll see why it's called that in a minute. Yeah, this oil rig, right? Deep Water Horizon oil rig. It had been other places, had success in drilling in other parts, right? And they can move it around and, you know, comes here and starts to drill into this really, really, really deep oil reservoir. So we've got a diagram to kind of illustrate. Oh yeah, and it's owned by BP. Okay, so you've got the water, right? It's about 5,000 feet here, which actually isn't that deep, all things considered. Certainly not as deep as like the open ocean, which is way more. But anyway, they get down all through the water, right? And they keep drilling all the way down to the oil and gas reservoir rock, right? It's like a horizontal rock layer, right? That's got all of this oil and gas in it. Almost like, you know, with groundwater, where it's kind of like a sponge that's soaked up a bunch of stuff, where it's a solid rock, right? But it's got all these other little droplets and things in it. And if you know, squeeze it, still will come out. Well, it's basically what it is, right? And what you have to kind of keep in mind mentally to be able to understand this, right, is that this stuff, the oil and gas, right, is under a tremendous amount of pressure, right? And it's also lower density. It's lighter weight than the rock and stuff around it, right? The oil and, you know, the gas is really light, right? So when you're drilling, right, and you come all the way down here and you actually drill into it, what's going to happen is you're going to have a ridiculous amount of pressure coming back up because this oil and gas in there is getting squeezed by the weight of all this other stuff on top of it, right? And the only reason why it wasn't already lost is because you have some sort of rock layer. You can think of this as being, I don't know, like a layer of impossibly hard, dense mudstone, right? That stops the oil and gas from squirting out onto the surface at ridiculous pressures, right? But essentially what happens with BP, right, is they drill down, they hit it, and before they can really finish establishing the well and getting it secured and in place and managing that pressure, there's a blowout, right? And safety features fail, right? And all the pressure of this stuff getting squeezed out, instead of being controlled and coming out of the well and, you know, filling up tankers and going off to be sold as petroleum. Instead, it comes up at some ridiculous high pressure, like explosive velocity, and there's tons of hot machinery and other stuff here, right? And it explodes, and it causes a gigantic fireball. It kills about 10 people instantaneously in the fire just from the initial explosion. About 20 others are injured in the process, right? And because this thing just had a blowout, right, and the well is not secure, this oil from the reservoir, right, just starts leaking out into the ocean. A ridiculous amount of oil starts leaking out. Something like 200 million gallons of oil is leaking out of this thing, right? This is what it looks like for an aerial photograph, right? It's kind of hard to put into words just how big this area is. Okay, so I went in Google Earth and measured it, and from here to here is 30 miles, right? So this thing is big, like ridiculously, unfathomably big, right? And for reference, right, if you're sitting on a boat in the open ocean and you look out at the horizon, you can only see about 3 miles before the curvature of the Earth makes it so that you can't see any further, right? So if you were here on a boat, like your maximum visibility would be like here, right? So this thing is huge. I mean, the entire coast is just inundated. And you can also see why they call it the Bird Foot Delta that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so ridiculously large oil spill. The Department of Defense and, you know, U.S. military is a large part of what coordinated this response because nobody else has the expertise, manpower, resources to be able to go and, you know, fix something on this scale. So it's emergency workers and people who work in the coast and for the oil company and military for the US who go out and do these things at once. The amount of documentation on this thing is absolutely ridiculous, but look, you can see like oil and water don't mix, you know, and the oil floats up to the top. So you end up with this really crazy looking gnarly stuff near the rig, right? Oil's washing up onto the beaches, destroying any wildlife that's here, washing up on people, degrading the soil and the land. You have this, you know, toxic sludge that washes up, right? Because the oil tends to come up to the surface. What do they do to try to contain or fix the problem, right? What was, you know, the military actually doing to try to fix it? Well, this is one idea. There's a specific term for it, which I've forgotten, right? But, you know, oil floats up to the top, right? So if you drop these things, you can contain the oil itself. Like this doesn't have to, you know, go all the way down to the bottom of the ocean to contain the oil spill. And that's a detail which is about to come back, right? So you could essentially put out these barriers, right, and be able to contain the spread, right? And then once you can contain the spread and stop it from going into other places any further, then you can kind of slowly work on it, is the idea, right? Yeah, so here we have some sort of vulnerable ecosystem, wetland on a barrier island, right? And you put this barrier around it and maybe another layer as well, right? And it stops the oil from getting there and destroying it. There was also this dispersant, right? So the idea, it didn't work, but the idea was that, okay, planes come over and spray this stuff on the ocean where there's oil, and this stuff, the dispersant chemical, essentially breaks big oil particles into little ones. And the idea was that by breaking it into little ones, the microbes in the water, which can eat the oil, albeit at a slow rate, would have these smaller pieces to kind of chew on, and would end up going much faster than if you have these big pools. It doesn't work, all right? What essentially ends up happening is, as a result of the dispersant, whenever it washes up on shore, right, it penetrates way further into the coast than it would if it were these big particles, because you just made them small, right? It penetrates way further into the coasts all around, and instead of being up on the surface, which is kind of where you want the oil to be, it sends it down in these kind of plumes that go beneath the surface, right? And yeah, controlled burns were another one. These were kind of for in this context, right? The environmental effects of these compared to the oil is negligible in this context, so this was fine, right? Skimmers, which literally just suck the oil out of the water, is another one, a little bit less effective. This is, you know, taking piss out of the pool water. Here's another shot of it washing up on shore, penetrating deeply and destroying very valuable wetlands, right? Destroying lots of wildlife, right? So fish covered in oil, right, en masse, decimates the fishing industry. Sea turtles in particular, many of which are endangered, and so were targets for remediation and specialized efforts. Seabirds, right, here's somebody trying to wash the oil off of one, including pelicans, right? Dolphins in the area, decimated. Whales covered in oil. It's really difficult to estimate the exact extent of this, but it's horrible, right? Coral reefs even, so as a result of the plume sinking down from the dispersant, you don't just affect the wildlife on the surface, you affect it all throughout the water column. It makes it harder to assess the damages, and also probably much worse. Human beings in that way made it much worse. Human health, right, so there's something like 100,000 workers on the project overall from different places. A lot of them developed cancer, rashes, respiratory issue, including millions of people on the coast who would have been affected by this. The total cost is hard to estimate. My estimate is about $300 billion. It could easily be up to $1 trillion, right, or more. So you have a loss in tourism, right? Tourism industry along the coast is big. Lost oil production, lost fishing, the damaging of biological resources, which is just hard to put into numbers. It is. And then human health, right? Millions of people, their health is damaged forever. They have medical bills, and there's also, you know, all the things they would have done if they hadn't gotten sick. So productivity loss from that. President goes down and does all this stuff, right? Tries to figure out who is liable and responds to it. BP eventually has to pay out about $65 billion, although overall, right, so this is their profits. Not really hurt by it. They end up being fine in the end. COVID did much more of a number than this. It led to a ban for about 4 years of BP doing any business in the Gulf, although as we can see long term it didn't really hurt them, although it did hurt their reputation a lot, especially in the United States. The U.S. Department of the Interior got rid of this management agency, the Mineral Management Agency, which was for some reason responsible for regulating and controlling this. It was determined in the end that BP was at fault. That agency was stripped and replaced by 3 more, which is probably a good idea, that are more specialized and able to solve the problem. And with that, we're ready to move on to our last one, Fukushima.